So today my guest is Peter Dickinson, UkraineAlert Editor at Atlantic Council. Hello and welcome.
Hi.
2 years war. My first question is, what do you think what this war taught us?
Well, I think the two key lessons I would say at this point are that Ukraine as a country is a lot stronger than people imagined. And Russia as a country is a lot weaker than people imagined. When the war began and before the war, the expectation was that Ukraine would not be able to stand alone, would not be able to withstand the Russian attack for more than a few days. There was expectations that Kiev would fall within a few days, that the whole Ukrainian government would be forced into exile or would collapse, that the state itself might cease to function. And that wasn't only Russia, that was also many in the West felt that as well. And that has not proved the case. On the contrary, Ukraine has proved far, far more resilient than people anticipated. They've managed to not only to defend the country, but also to regain a lot of the territory that was lost during those chaotic first few weeks. So Ukraine now has regained around 50% of the territory that Russia was able to seize in those first weeks when they had the element of surprise and there was a significant degree of chaos in Ukraine. So Ukraine has surprised the world. I would imagine probably Ukraine has surprised themselves to a degree. As someone who's lived here a long time, I was not shocked, but I was certainly pleasantly surprised to see how strong Ukraine was and has come out of it. And on the other side of the coin, then you have Russia, which was positioned as this great military superpower. That has not come to pass. They look a lot weaker today than they did a few years ago. Certainly now a lot of people are questioning what they thought about Russia before 2022 in terms of the claims Russia made about its strength. But having said that, still, there's absolutely no room for complacency. Russia is still advancing. Russia's military is a very blunt force instrument. It's essentially just powering and pummeling its way across eastern Ukraine at the moment, destroying towns and cities in its path, very methodically and very slowly. Now, it's not a particularly sophisticated approach from a military point of view, but it is effective, sadly. So I wouldn't want to suggest that everything is looking very optimistic, but certainly I would say if you take a broad view, Ukraine certainly looks a lot stronger today than it did a few years ago, and Russia on the contrary.
Strong Ukraine is now a shield for Europe. Does Europe feel some danger from Russia now?
More and more. I think again, going back 2 years, very few people in Europe would have realistically felt that they were in any threat from Russia. I think perhaps the exceptions would be the countries closest to Russia, the Baltic states and Poland in particular. But now I think there is a recognition amongst many in Europe that there is a threat from Russia. Now, it's not necessarily a direct military threat. I don't think we're talking about Russian tanks on the streets of Paris or Madrid. But we are talking about increasingly aggressive Russian actions against European countries. The kind of hybrid warfare that we saw in Ukraine from 2014, for example. Cyber attacks, destabilization, little green men scenarios, attacks on infrastructure. Certainly, information attacks are already underway. You could argue that the hybrid war is already in full flow in Europe. So I think in recent months especially, there's been a recognition in Europe that this is their war and they have to deal with this. And in particular, because of the situation that's happening in American Congress, where aid is currently deadlocked, Europe is having to realize, A, they can't rely on America to protect them, and B, Russia is a threat to them.
Also speaking about support of US and what's now going on in US in Congress, how do you think whether we will get this support? When? Why? Why US now waiting?
Well, the why is at least superficially very easy. It's Donald Trump. Donald Trump has said no. Donald Trump he has a huge grip on the Republican Party, which controls Congress at the moment. And he has basically said no, and he's put a block on it. And anyone in his party who steps out of line knows that if he wins the presidential elections this year, they will be removed. He will remove them. He will take his revenge, as it were, for their disloyalty. That's his position. Now, we can speculate why that is position. Is it simply a matter of him wishing to undermine Joe Biden, the president, and to gain an advantage in the election? Is there something more sinister in terms of his relationship with Russia and his desire for closer links with Vladimir Putin? That's actually, at this point, we are really speculating. But clearly there's something going on here with Donald Trump, I would say, with Russia. But again, there's no concrete evidence of that. But regardless of the why this is, it's clear that he has taken this position. So it's going to take a lot of effort to get round that block. But having said that, in Congress, we know there is a clear majority of support for Ukraine amongst congressmen, both Democrats and Republicans. So there's no real question that if the bill is brought to the floor in the House of Representatives, it will be passed. The question is now, can it be brought there? There's a lot of negotiations at the moment going on. There's all sorts of different mechanisms that can be used, which are not standard practices, but could be used. So I think over the next month, we'll see a lot of different manoeuvring. And I still think that there's a good chance it will come to pass eventually, but it will take some time, and it's not guaranteed.
Mm-hmm. On your opinion, is Trump not afraid of Putin? He wants to join him, or what? Putin is like a monster.
Well, certainly that's the view. That's the view for anyone who lives in close proximity to Putin. I think that's probably the global view now as well. Mm-hmm. Trump's position on Putin has always been quite strange in terms of for an American leader. Even going back to when he was running for president in 2015, he often spoke, and even in fact going back before that, he often spoke said very openly complimentary things about Putin, specifically about the fact that he's a monster or that he's a dictator. He said, what a wonderful dictator he is, what a strong, clever guy he is, how he rules his country with an iron fist. Again, I mean, this is Trump's character. Trump has an affinity for strong leaders. He has an affinity. He often praises the leader of China. He often praises the leader of North Korea. This is unprecedented behavior for a senior American politician, certainly a president or a former president or a candidate for the presidency, to praise dictators. Trump does it openly, so we can speculate about why that is, what personality traits in Trump make him do that. But it's clear that he does. It's clear that he does have a genuine respect for these figures and a genuine admiration for these figures. That he thinks that is good. And I think it's probably, I don't think it's controversial to say that he would be quite comfortable ruling in that manner if he thought that Americans would accept that.
From time to time, I ask my guests whether US or European countries are tired of Ukraine, and really often, Kremlin's propaganda says this narrative. They say that the whole world is tired of Ukraine. What about Americans?
Well, the polling doesn't really support this. I think there is clearly a decline in interest. I think that's inevitable. There's so much going on in the world. People around the world won't remain focused on Ukraine for years and years and years. That's just simply not realistic. But there's a very strong and quite consistent level of interest in Ukraine and recognition that what's happening in Ukraine, that Ukraine's fight for freedom against Russia is important for the wider world. It's not simply a matter of supporting Ukraine because it's the morally right thing to do. It's a recognition that this is important for the entire planet, that this will define the kind of world we live in for many years to come, maybe for decades to come, that the outcome of the war in Ukraine and Russia's defeat is important in order to live in a world a rules-based world, a world where we have security and stability. And I think that's clear to most people, certainly in America, certainly in most European countries. What we do see, of course, is a big decline in media interest, because media needs news stories constantly. They can't continue to run images. Again, this is a cynical approach, but every single Ukrainian town that is destroyed is a crime and a tragedy. But to a foreigner sitting in New York or Paris or Buenos Aires, it all looks the same. And at some point, they just become, the news moves on. So media-wise, there's been a clear drop in interest. Mm-hmm. Politically, there's other things on the agenda as well that they have to deal with. But I think generally, there's a recognition this is a very important issue, and support for Ukraine remains high. There was a poll just came out of Germany just a few days ago, which showed that support for arming Ukraine had actually increased significantly in the last 6 months, which I think is very interesting, particularly as it's Germany, which has always been a very pacifist nation.
Speaking about the war and the beginning of the war that began with Crimea can only end with the liberation of Crimea. Everything started there. But how? How can Crimea now be liberated? In what way? Diplomatically or not?
Well, I think the most realistic policy for Crimea is isolation, and then some sort of a process to deoccupy it. I think to militarily invade Crimea and fight, inch by inch, a war would be possible, but would be very challenging and very costly in terms of the number of Ukrainian soldiers who would be killed, and the amount of time and money that would require. But because Crimea is essentially an island, I think it lends itself very well to a blockade of sorts, to cut Crimea off, certainly from the occupied regions in southern Ukraine, and then cut the bridge off, prevent air supplies as much as possible, and then there'll be an inevitability, I think, to the situation. I think we've already seen. I mean, Crimea. The Russians have always, since Russia seized Crimea, the Russians have portrayed Crimea as a very sacred thing, a very the jewel in the crown of the Russian Empire, Putin's greatest triumph, and they've tried to put a red line there and say you can't touch Crimea. Crimea is off. We can talk about other things, but Crimea is off the table. It's not up for discussion. And yet, when Ukraine sank around a quarter of the Black Sea Fleet, the Russians did not react with any dramatic escalations. They retreated. They pulled their ships away. They're building a new port now in occupied Georgia, in Abkhazia. And they are being very quiet about it. So they recognize that they've suffered a military defeat, and their response is very practical. They've withdrawn. So actually, I don't see any reason to believe that wouldn't be the case for Crimea as a whole if Ukraine is able to isolate Crimea and put it under an effective blockade, and then also, of course, attack it from distance with long-range weapons.
And what do you think? Was it possible to somehow prevent this war?
Well, I think that if we look back at each stage of the war, I think that the prevention really would have needed to come from the West. The West would have needed to have been very emphatic in its support for Ukraine. Obviously, we can go back to 2008 and say that if Ukraine had been allowed into NATO or given a clear membership plan in 2008, there's a good chance that could have perhaps prevented it. After the seizure of Crimea in 2014, if the West had reacted very strongly then, and said, okay, this is a complete breach of all international law, and if they then placed very severe sanctions on Russia and also armed Ukraine and also perhaps even deployed troops in Ukraine, that would have prevented the war. Crimea would have been under occupation, and that would have been a major issue, but we would not have had the major European war that we have today. So looking at it with the benefit of hindsight from today's position, I think that the West has consistently underestimated the threat from Russia and has consistently been too weak in its responses to Russian aggression. And each time that has encouraged more and more Russian aggression. So really, that would be the only way I think that we could realistically have stopped this. Because what we've got is the West saying, we don't want to escalate. And that fear of escalation is exactly what provokes Russia to escalate more.
More and more,
yeah.
Absolutely. Speaking about support, my last question, F-16, money, NATO support, which support Ukraine needs most of all now, in your opinion?
Well, there's no single, magic weapon, magic bullet, silver bullet, whatever you want to call it. They need a complex of support. Certainly they need, the basics. They need a massive amount of ammunition, bullets, artillery, tanks. F-16s will be wonderful. Long-range missiles will be very important. Technological aspect. Now, the West has a huge advantage over Russia in terms of its technological capabilities. They need to give that to Ukraine as much as possible. So we need to see Ukraine have an overwhelming advantage in the drone war, which is, in fact, possibly the decisive front, or certainly one of the decisive fronts. Ukraine needs to have the overwhelming advantage there, and the West has the technologies to make that happen.
Absolutely.
So there's a wide range of different aspects that there are different types of support the West can give. They need it all. I think long term, if we're talking about how to resolve this problem and have actually peace in Europe, Ukraine needs to be either in NATO or it needs to have NATO equivalent security agreements, treaties with other European countries. At the moment, I don't see either of those things. We have these so-called security pacts and agreements that have been signed recently, which is good. It's not a bad thing, but they are not commitments to fight for Ukraine, and that is the only thing that will actually prevent further wars in the future.
And by the way, NATO is the long-term perspective or not?
It's a perspective. Honestly, I still think it's unlikely at this stage, and given the, I mean, I think it should happen. Certainly, I think logically it should happen. I think it would be in everybody's interest for it to happen. But I see so much resistance from within the NATO alliance that it still looks like a very challenging task for Ukraine and for supporters of Ukraine in NATO to get to that point. Which is why I say let's look at some equivalents. Of course, NATO is realistically the solution, but there is so much reticence, there is so much reluctance amongst NATO members at this stage. So let's see. But I think we need to recognise that they need some form of a watertight, solid, Article 5 equivalent commitment to Ukraine's security, or we're going to be here again down the line, even if and when Ukraine wins this war.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for this interview, for your answer, for your opinion. I'll remind to our viewers it was speaker Dickinson, UkraineAlert Editor at Atlantic Council.